So outside of Kennewick Man, hasn't been a single finding more than 2,600 years ago.
Is there DNA evidence for the Nephites and the Lamanites in the Americas? Well, listen to the interview and decide for yourself. I think without question, the research here at least gives an opening. This episode is brought to you by Go and Do Travel. I am the official spokesperson for Go and Do Travel and the Wave Makers Podcasters Cruise. This is November 15th through 22nd this year, 2025. We are bringing several different popular, high-profiled YouTubers and podcasters to this cruise. Each will be presenting. And you know that online community that exists among the Latter-day Saints? This is an opportunity to take that community and meet them in person, both the podcasters and the community. This cruise is going down the Mexican Baja. Who's coming? Well, Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith, Cardin Ellis of Org Radio, Hayden and Jackson Paul from The Stick of Joseph, Jasmine Rapalai, David Boyce from 52 Churches in 52 Weeks, and David Butler of Plain and Precious Things. It's going to be a blast. This is going to be a lot of fun. To find out more, go to cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com. Go to the top at Trips and Events, and then scroll down to Wave Makers. We'll see you there. Here's the interview. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we bring on David Reed, who has been doing research on the links or possible links between the Lehites and the Native Americans in the research, his DNA and genetic research. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, so let's start off with this. It's most everything that we've seen as DNA research has become more prevalent in the last 15 years or so. Yeah, I'd say about 15 years. There's been a lot of pushback on Latter-day Saints and the Book of Mormon and saying, well, it's not possible. Everything we see from the DNA and the genetic lines of Native Americans come from Asia and support a crossing of the Bering Strait. And here we have the Native American population, but there's no real link to the Middle East. What do you say to that?
I say that that is true, that's what most people say, but it's not actually true. And so the real question is that what do you do with the links that do show up to the Middle East? Because when you do the DNA research, when the research has been done, yes, there are a lot of Asian DNA types among Native Americans. So it's clear that a significant part of the Native American ancestry came from Asia, came across the Bering Strait. Likely that seems pretty clear, but there have been DNA links found that aren't Asian DNA types. And then the question is then what do you do with that? And all three types of DNA testing, they all have found non-Asian links as well. And the three types are, so on the mother's line, the mitochondrial DNA type. On that line, there's the Haplogroup X, and Rod Melderman and others have talked about Haplogroup X. When you look at where Haplogroup X comes from and the likely place of origin, the most likely place is the Near East or the Middle East. And in particular, a likely location is the Levant. Now, the question on that one and the real dispute on that one is whether that came across, like the Book of Mormon describes, directly from the Near East and Book of Mormon timeframes, or whether, as the mainstream science would indicate or say, that, well, it may have originated in the Middle East, but it must have come across, with the Asian populations, and they just haven't found evidence showing that yet.
So let me clarify that. So you're saying that the primary, let's say, mainstream view of this is, if you look at Haplogroup X, is that the most likely, but not necessarily for sure, but the most likely place that would come from would be the Middle East. That's and correct. Then therefore they need to show that the Middle Eastern blood was mixed with those in Asia that came across the Bering Strait and ended up here in the Americas.
Yeah, and they don't find any of the Haplogroup X in Eastern Siberia or in any of those regions going across. There's no archaeological evidence of it. So they say that, well, we must just not have found it yet. But
why do you think, I mean, just looking at that, why is there not is it because there's a narrative that's already in place for geneticists and they're not saying they don't want to accept an opening up of the book, so to speak, and say, well, here's another chapter, here's something else we can learn? Are they sticking to the narrative, or what? Do they have other evidence that says, no, this haplogroup X is definitely not from the Middle East?
It's driven by the narrative, but there is evidence that has to be addressed, and it gets relatively complex. But the key issues are, when did that haplogroup X line, that's the line that's found in Native Americans, how long ago did that split from what was in the Middle East? And to determine that, you have to make assumptions. And the mainstream science has been, with the full theory of evolution, that mutations take a long time. So they have assumed mutation rates and a molecular clock. And they say, okay, if everything happened over as long a period as they think, then when you're looking at that haplogroup X, and they say, well, that's, at least 15,000 years ago, it'll range anywhere from 14,000 to 30,000 years ago. So they say it's just way too long ago. But that's the main issue. And that's one of the key issues that I've been trying to talk about a lot, which is that the mutation rates that they have been assuming are incorrect. And I think it's actually a much more condensed mutation rate. And then the other thing is, for haplogroup X, there was a Native American skeleton named Kennewick Man. Yes. And he tested as haplogroup X, which is this Middle Eastern DNA type. And
what time frame does he come from?
That's the question. So what they say is that the carbon dating proves him to have lived about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. But when they did his carbon dating, they took about 20 different test samples. About 5 of those actually fit within the Book of Mormon timeframe. So the majority fit the 8,000 to 9,000 year ago timeframe. A minority, about 5 of those, about 20 tests came out to the Book of Mormon timeframe, about 2,000 to 2,600 years ago. So then the question becomes, okay, so which is right, which is wrong? And the mainstream has accepted the older date. I argue for the more recent date, arguing that with his burial, there are signs of artificial aging that has changed the carbon date to make him look older than he was. And actually, when they did the carbon date testing of the soil around him, the majority of the tests of the soil around him also tested much older than it actually was, actually impossibly old, even older than the soil layers below it.
So let me ask you in the first place, why is the Kennewick Man so iconic? Right? I've even heard of this guy. Why is he iconic? What is the reason for that?
Well, he's interesting. So let me pull this. So I've done a book, Face of a Nephite. This here is the artistic reconstruction done from his skull, done by the Smithsonian. And so I don't know if you get a bigger picture on there. So when he was found, first of all, extremely well-preserved skeleton. And when he was found, there was a dispute as to whether he was actually Native American or not because of his appearance. Because when he was found...
Hold that back up there real quick. Just hold it up, because I didn't capture that as big. Okay. So this is basically the reconstruction of Kennewick Man, what he would look like.
Yeah, there's another...
Why do they have him bearded?
So you don't know the beard. Yes, what you get is the facial structure, and you can kind of figure out the eyes and the nose shape a little bit. But in terms of the hair, that's just artistic license. There's another famous one of him that looks like Patrick Stewart, the famous actor, Jean-Luc Picard.
Sure.
Yeah, that's the other. So there are 2 reconstructions from his skull, one that came out looking like Jean-Luc Picard and the other one looking like that. Okay. But at any rate, when he was found, there was the initial reaction was, this looks like not a Native American, looks like a European. And then there was a dispute because he also had features that looked ancient. And so that's then triggered the carbon dating and other things. And then he was determined to be an ancient Native American. But one of the interesting things about it is there ended up being a legal dispute about whether he was Native American or not. And some of the scientists were arguing that he wasn't Native American so that they could do more complete testing on the skeleton. And so part of it was just sort of a delay tactic so that before the tribes could have him reburied and prevent further testing, they were arguing that he wasn't Native American so they could.
Where was he found?
In Kennewick, Washington, which is along the
Kennewick, Washington.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the Northwest, and around the time of, again, what is your estimation?
I think that the 5 carbon dates that put him in the 2000 to 2600 years ago timeframe would be the right ones.
Okay, so putting him right in the Nephite era.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what are the other arguments that are pushing against what you're trying to do? And what, by the way, let me back up a second here. What made you decide? You're a patent attorney, is that right?
Yes. I am a judge, former patent attorney.
Okay. What is it that brought you about to decide you're going to research these things? Did you already have a background in this?
No. So as a patent attorney, one of the things that you do is you have to get up to speed on a variety of different technical backgrounds for each of the cases that you have. And so I have experience in researching a wide variety of the technical backgrounds. And what happened was when this, the DNA really came to the forefront about the Native Americans in the Book of Mormon, I became interested in what the evidence really showed. So I took the information that, for example, Rod Meldrum was starting to put out. I took the information that Dr. Hugo Perego, who's an LDS scientist, he'd written a number of articles on it. And I took that information and then I just kind of went into the citations and went from there. And what I found was that not only was the Haplogroup X evidence panning out, but I found additional evidence that I then started to try to share. There's additional evidence that corroborates the Haplogroup X, the non-Asian DNA type, and that's another significant portion.
Okay, so Haplogroup X. So let's get to this again. So the Haplogroup X is everybody knows about this. It's present in the Native Americans, or at least in some of the tribes. And by the way, where is this mostly found? The Haplogroup X.
Mostly in the eastern parts of North America. So it's mostly with the Algonquin tribes. It's also found in, for example, with the Navajo and stuff in the western U.S.
But you've got the Ojibwe, the Seminole, the Sioux, the Cherokee, the Tohono, O'odham. Okay, and those kind of groups up in there, and which is up into the Great Lakes area and down further south, and
that's correct.
That area over there. Okay, so the Haplogroup X. You say you've got additional evidence beyond this, because that opens up the door to a possibility. But you've got more evidence, you believe, that corroborates the Book of Mormon migration. Yeah,
because there's other DNA testing too. So you can also the Haplogroup X, that's the matrilineal line, the mitochondrial DNA. It's passed only through the mother down the female line. And then, but you can also test on the male line, the patrilineal line, the Y chromosome DNA testing. And they've done DNA testing in that part too. And when they look at Native Americans in these same areas that you get the high concentrations of the Haplogroup X, you also get high concentrations of Y DNA, haplogroup R, particularly R1b, which is not considered an Asian DNA type either. That is actually mostly considered a European DNA type, or is also found in the Middle East and among Jews. So and you find it in the same tribes, co-located, and with very high percentages. So, for example, with a Y DNA R in some of those Algonquin tribes, you're getting over half of the men. You can only test the men. You can get over half of the men testing with this DNA type. And these are men who claim that they have pure Native ancestry. And the science hasn't, the mainstream has, kind of gagged on that. And so what their position is, well, this must be all since Columbus. But these are Native Americans who claim pure ancestry. And you're talking about over 50% of some of those tribes having it. And then in addition, you're finding mutation levels that are so high that you're finding mutations, several mutations away from anything that's been found in Europe. So all of that points to an ancient origin. So there is a small subset of scientists that are starting to look at the Y DNA haplogroup R1b as a potentially authentic DNA type 2, which would fit as well.
Now, the Y, though, I know that my understanding is that there's two major Y chromosome haplogroups that are identified, though, with the Siberian areas.
Yes. Okay. Well, at least Asian. That's correct. And that's like the Q and C, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. And so are those similar or the same exactly to the Y groups that you're talking about?
No. So with Native Americans, what I'm saying is that there are actually three. There are two that are generally accepted as authentic Native American ancestral lines, but there's a third one which is not accepted, but is showing very high. And this is the Y DNA R1b, which the mainstream has rejected. So even though these tribes are showing over 50% of the men having this DNA type, even though this DNA type shows several mutations away from anything found in Europe, they're saying that nevertheless, it must have come post-Columbus. So they're refusing to accept it as an authentic DNA type at this time. And it's co-located in the same tribes and areas as the haplogroup X is.
Right, because you've got those two together. So two pieces of, we'll call it evidence,
right,
of being brought together that are both opening up the possibility of Middle Eastern origins. Partially, right. Obviously, it's partially, and we might note also that going back to the church, they don't have an official position on this, but they did. They seem to have moved. In the 1981 version of the introduction to the Book of Mormon, it said that they were the Lehites were the primary ancestors of the Native Americans, and they changed that in I think 2003, I want to say, to they are among the ancestors. So the church is saying, look, we're going to open this up a little bit more. And I think, looking at it, I think it is a response to the DNA tests. And they're kind of like, they're going to be a little bit more cautious about being that precise about what the origins are of the Native Americans. I mean, it's pretty obvious that there are several peoples, I think at this point, that have populated the Americas, and among them would be the Lehites.
Yeah, that's correct.
And the Mulekites, and I suppose the Jaredites.
Yeah. And like I said, I think you're right in terms of the motivation, and I think that is correct in terms of to be safe on what's true there.
Do you see any distinctions? I want to just jump to the side a little bit here. Have you done any research on distinctions from what we would find? I mean, I don't know how far along we are in being able to test in our genetic testing right now, but there are three different groups found in the Book of Mormon. And do we know how, would we be able to distinguish that as well? Are we to a point where you're even looking at that yet?
No, and the reason being is that there's very little of the ancient DNA testing. So there's a significant amount of the modern Native Americans who are tested all throughout the Americas, and they do that based off of voluntary compliance, and the people say that they're Native ancestry or so forth. For the ancient ones, there is the Native American Graves Protection Act, which essentially allows tribes to veto or object to testing. And so the result of that is there's very little of the ancient Native American DNA testing anymore. Now, there has been some, and when they have done that, they have found, for example, the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X is one of the ones that they have found anciently. So it has been documented to be ancient, but on the Y DNA, I'm not aware of any good Y DNA ancient tests that have shown this Y DNA haplogroup R. And frankly, if they did find it, they would assume that it was contamination from one of the researchers and just reject it.
Okay, so what my understanding is, and just kind of educate the audience here, my understanding is that you can get to some degree of an understanding of a time period beyond carbon testing on the DNA itself. In other words, can you measure a time frame? Can you see the time frame of the mutations in the DNA, right?
Okay.
Over time.
So that's it is true that the scientists do try to do that. They do try to use DNA to estimate time frames. My argument is that that doesn't work logically. It's highly unreliable, particularly when you're only talking about going back a few mutations. There are only 4 key defining mutations between, for example, Haplogroup X and what's found back in the Old World. The oldest, nearest relative to the Native Americans on the Haplogroup X side is from the Middle East. It's only 4 distinct defining mutations between those. And so the question is how long does it take those 4 mutations to occur? Now, what the mainstream science will say is that, well, on average, it takes 4,000 years or so between any of those mutations. And so that part of how they say that Haplogroup X probably came 16,000 years ago is by saying, well, there's these 4 defining mutations. It's about 4,000 years on average between mutations. If you assume their full evolutionary theory of, over 100,000, 200,000 years from the evolving from the most recent common ancestor with chimpanzees. So it's all based on evolutionary theories. And they say, okay, well, we estimate with 4 mutations, it would take about 16,000 years to do that. But the thing is that mutations are random. It's sort of like rolling a die. So it's like, if they're right, it would be like rolling a 1 on a 200-sided die. So it should happen approximately once every 200 generations, makes about 4,000 years. But you don't know. You don't know how often it takes to roll that 1 those 4 times. You don't know how many generations it took to get just those 4 mutations. So they may say 16,000 years, but they have no clue. It's only 4 mutations. Okay. That could be 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 5,000 years. You don't know. So that's what I'm saying is it's a highly unreliable thing that they will spit out the number and act like it's reliable, but it's not.
And they do they accept that as well? Would you say mainstream, they accept that the DNA is not a good measure of time frame?
No, okay. no. But that's, so I don't know if you know, I did this a debate with artificial intelligence with Grok.
Yes.
And part of the reason I did that is because Grok, while, artificial intelligence, while it has its flaws, it is more readily available, and it's less evasive, and it's less ashamed to admit an error or admit risk. And so with that debate with Grok, part of the reason I did that is because when you press Grok, it admits that, with four mutations, you don't really know.
So give me, let's hold on. I'm going to hold this and come back to it in a second here. Just here, can I get on to your X here? Did you do it on X, or did you just do it out of the Grok app?
Oh, I just did it out of the Grok app.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So can you run us through what you did with the debate on Grok?
Say that again.
Can you run us through your debate a little more specifically with Grok?
Yeah. So, and what I did a YouTube video related to this, but so essentially, if you go to artificial intelligence, and again, artificial intelligence has its issues. There are times where it'll say the evidence that says this, and if you challenge it, it's like so as a lawyer, it's like cross-examining a hostile witness, right?
Sure. If
you say, okay, what's your basis for that? There are times it'll say, I had no basis for that. So what it does is people, it is an extremely intelligent system, but what people don't realize is when it goes for answers, it will go to web pages that it thinks that are reliable, and it does a shortcut, and it basically just takes a shortcut off of the, certain web pages or sources that it deems reliable, and it'll just spit that out. And sometimes if that source will say something, it'll say it without knowing whether it's true or not. And so then
it's just trying to gather a consensus. That's all it's doing.
Yes, that's correct. So, but one of the advantages of Grok, like I said, it doesn't resort to personality attacks. It's not evasive. It's not ashamed to correct. It's not ashamed to admit when it's wrong. You can challenge it. It'll follow up. So it's good. And so with this debate with Grok, what I did was I just took artificial intelligence and I went step by step. Step one, is mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X, X2A in particular, an authentic Native American DNA type? It's yes. Step two, where did this DNA type originate? It says the Near East, which means the Middle East. I followed up.
Let me just interject there for a second. And most would say the same thing. Would you say that most people would say the same thing?
If they really know what they're talking about.
Would they say, well, there's other examples beyond that, but primarily that's where Haplogroup X originates from?
So there's a level of difference, right? So the experts who really know the research will admit that it originated in the Middle East, most likely. But there's a whole layer below that, and that's all of the anti-Mormons and all the attacks where they say, no, everything's Asian, everything's from Asia, nothing came from the Middle East, Haplogroup X came from Asia. They say that, but that's not actually true. Even if you get into the peer-reviewed literature and you look at the ones who have tested it most, it will document that it came from the Middle East. And the way you know that, and in the debate with Grok, I just said, okay, how do you know it came from the Near East? And it says that's the location where you have the most diversity of mutations, and you have what they call the basal lineages, meaning the earliest in the family tree. And then you also have the highest concentrations there. So when you look, where in the world did this haplogroup X likely originate? It's very clearly from the Middle East, because that's where there's the highest diversity, the earliest base of the tree lineages, and the highest concentrations. And then when I followed up with Grok and I said, can you identify where specifically in the Near East? It says that's hard to do, but the first most likely location it listed was the Levant, which includes Israel. So it really does. It identifies it as a Middle Eastern DNA with a most likely origin being the Near East, including the Levant, Israel. But then it just get into the debate about the timeframes, because what it'll then say is, but this was 30,000 years ago, and then it'll say, and this is shown, and it'll point to Kennewick Man, it'll point to, and it'll say there's archaeological evidence of the haplogroup X more than 15,000 years ago. But with that one, I followed up and I said, what archaeological evidence, what direct evidence do you have? And the only one is Kennewick Man. So outside of Kennewick Man, hasn't been a single finding more than 2,600 years ago. It's solely based on the assumed mutation rates, and then it's solely based on Kennewick Man. And like I said, Kennewick Man, some of the carbon dating actually puts them in the Book of Mormon timeframes.
So you're saying that the genetic testing on that we have today, there is nothing aside from Kennewick Man that we have found that lived longer than 2,600 years ago?
Absolutely. And that was one of the questions I followed up with Grok. Outside of Kennewick Man, has there been any other finding of haplogroup X before, X2A, which is the Native American, line of the X? Has there any been finding outside of Kennewick Man more than 2,600 years ago? And it says no.
That's obviously very interesting, because that puts you back obviously 600 BC, right. and there's no findings that go beyond that.
Correct.
Now, let me just say, I mean, as
and I'm telling you, Greg, this is rock solid. I'm right on this. So there'll be people that say I'm wrong, but I'm telling you, I'm right on it.
Okay, so nothing but beyond 2,600 for haplogroup X anywhere.
Correct. Well, for X2A, which is the Native American lineage.
X2A. By the way, what is what is okay? Well, what about the Y DNA? Does that get? Is there anything beyond 2,600 years ago for the Y DNA? I mean, that's going to be different, right? Because those are associated also with those that would be from the Bering Strait.
Yeah. So the Y DNA is the flip side. The Y DNA is, they're saying, we don't accept that as authentic ancestral. It must have been only since Columbus. It must be mixing with European since Columbus. So with Y DNA, the answer is no. We don't have any DNA testing proving it in the Americas before Columbus. But that's due to, in my opinion, due to the paucity, the lack of DNA testing for it. But what you do have with the Y DNA, the Y DNA R, which is this non-Asian DNA type, which is found in Europe, which is found in the Middle East, including in a significant percentage of Jews, sort of on the 10 to 30% range. What they have found with it is that there are several mutations away from anything that's found back in the old world, several mutations away from anything in Europe. So some of the Native Americans that were tested with this were 4 to 8 mutations away. So more mutations away than anything on the X side. But anyway, more mutations away than what they're basing the X side to say that it's too old. But on the Y side, they're saying it's too young. So they say the X is too old, the Y is too young. But yet, like I said, they're co-located in the same populations, indicating to me that they came together. And I just don't see a rational explanation for how you would have so many mutations of the Y DNA R1b away from anything that's found in Europe, unless it was an actual ancient Native American DNA type.
Now you go as far as to say, get even more specific with an R1b, 1a, 1a2.
And I think it's actually broader than that, but that is one of the ones. Yes.
That's one of the ones that gets more specific. What does that mean as you add on the letters and numbers to these?
Think of DNA as like a big family tree, mm-hmm. and each additional one of those is another little branch So you have, the R1 family, and then you have it split, and you have an R1A family and an R1B family, and then those mm-hmm. split. And so it's just kind of denominating your splits as you go down the family tree.
As you go down, which is each one of those splits is a different source.
Yeah. Well, right? It's a mutation that happens.
It's a mutation. Okay.
It's a mutation that happens, which will then get passed on to everyone after it. So
it's a mutation.
A branch.
What causes the mutation? Is it generational?
Like it's like a random die roll. Like I said, a mutation. They think it's about the mainstream science will say it's about once every 200 some generations. Okay. You'll get one of these mutations that sticks, and then everyone out after it sticks. Now, there's a whole separate argument, because when they have done testing of pedigree charts to find out how often mutations happen, the rates that they found are more than 10 times what they're assuming with evolutionary rates. So I think that that's the that what you actually get are mutation rates that are much, much faster than assumed, that the family tree is more compressed than what they're projecting as a 200,000 year family tree.
Yeah. To me, the thing that I find the most interesting so far of what you're saying is that there's nothing beyond 2,600 years for Haplo X. I mean, that's
for the X2A. Yeah.
That for X2A, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because they've had obviously several specimens that they can pull from, and yet there's none there that show that Haplo X2A, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
They have found other Haplogroup X ones, for example, in Ohio and Illinois, ranging to the 100 BC to 100 AD timeframe, which document the X2A there, but nothing more than 2,600 years ago. Nowhere. Okay. Kennewick Man's the only one, and that's artificially aged, in my opinion.
What is next? What are you trying to push for next, or what would you need next to bring this further and supportive of a Lehite exodus?
Well, I'm still doing the DNA side. What I've looked at are some additional types of genetic testing that exist as well. So, and I should note that those also show a non-Asian contribution to Native Americans. This happens with blood types. With blood types, you can see that they don't just match what was found in Eastern Asians. You can find this with human leukocyte antigens, which have been tested for genetics. Those also show a surprising level of non-Asian ancestry. And then most importantly, with the autosomal DNA testing, which is where they test the whole DNA and sort of take little panorama and snippets of it and kind of create a little panorama of it. What you find is that for all of the Americas, there is a little bit of non-Asian ancestry. That's generally, the mainstream science will generally write off, well, that must all be from since Columbus. And that's a whole separate argument too, because, for example, there's a 2018 study where they started looking at that and they said, this is a higher contribution than would be expected from the historical records. And then what they ended up interpreting and saying is, well, there must have been a whole lot more Jews that came over with the Spaniards and excluded from the testing anything that showed generations more than 20 generations ago. But so there's that. And then in particular on that autosomal DNA testing, like I said, all through the Americas, you see a little bit more than expected. But then for the Algonquin tribes, where you are seeing the haplogroup X and you're seeing the Y-DNA-R, you're seeing the autosomal DNA showing half or more non-Asian ancestry.
Okay. Yeah, so that's exciting stuff. What would it take for mainstream geneticists to start looking more at what you're studying? What would convince them at this point? What would hard evidence be for them to say, oh, yeah, maybe this looks like it is Middle Eastern in source?
Well, it's hard. I mean, you've got a philosophy background, so you understand how paradigms work and how it can be hard to shift out of a paradigm. It's definitely a paradigm, and so what you get is when they do the testing for Native Americans, anytime they find something that doesn't fit the Asian Beringian migration theory, they're excluding it, saying, well, it must be contamination, must have come from the researchers, must be contamination. They say, so it's a real tendency to force the data to continue to stick with the theory.
Or they're not going to get the funding for it.
Yeah, maybe so. But so just like with Haplogroup X, what you need are just sort of indisputable ancient findings. But again, the problem with that is it's very hard to get those, particularly in the United States, because of the protection that the Native American tribes don't want people, digging up the skeletons and testing them.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think we're going to need to bring you back on here and talk about this a little bit more in depth.
Yeah.
But where do people find you? Where is the best place for them to go to learn more about this?
So I have a YouTube channel called Uncovering Lamanite History. And in that, I do the DNA stuff. I also look at other scientific evidence related to uncovering Native American ancestry and history. So that's probably the best place. Like I said, I do have a book called Face of a Nephite that could be found with Digital Legend Press. It's also at the Book of Mormon evidence.org website. What I have done a fair amount of work with Rod Meldrum and that Firm Foundation as well. So those that are familiar with that work would see me through there and have seen presentations I've done.
We'll be sure to put those links in the description box so that people can click on them and look at it and purchase the book. So, David, really appreciate your time. You've put in, obviously, I don't know how many hours into this and looking at it. And
it has been, it's more than you think.
I don't
over the years. It's in the thousands of hours.
Well, I mean, and the key on this obviously is that you're fighting against a narrative. So you have to show very precisely the evidence.
Yeah.
For this to have, some credibility and to have people look at it. And you've obviously done that. So,
yeah. And so that is a key part. And if I could just make a comment too.
Sure,
so,
go ahead.
As you probably know, one of the common responses I will get is people who've looked at the DNA Gospel Topics essay, and they say, but, the church has the DNA Gospel Topics essay, and they basically say there's no evidence, there's no DNA evidence, and you shouldn't look at the DNA evidence to try to prove the Book of Mormon. And the answer is that yes, that was the understanding that they had when that essay was written. That essay was written by Dr. Perego and others, and that was the understanding, the best understanding of the DNA at the time. And I'm not saying that this new DNA evidence proves the Book of Mormon, but what I am saying is that there is additional evidence which is consistent with the Book of Mormon, and I think we can flip it from being a negative, a frequent attack against the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon and say, wait a second, there actually is evidence, and we can flip that to a positive, that there is significant evidence which seems consistent with the Book of Mormon account of an actual Nephite, Lamanite population that was significant in the Americas and not just something that disappeared.
And if we can do that, and then obviously it becomes a strength and not a weakness. And
right.
That's happened on so many fronts with the Book of Mormon already.
Right.
So would love to see that here as well. David, thanks so much for your time. We will put those links in the description box for the viewers and the listeners. And we'll probably see you again.
All right. Thank you, Greg.